And Becky and Fred know her, and Jim know her a lot better than I do. She's with the college, and you have your own counseling service. I asked her to come because I have a lot of questions. And I already warned her that I might say something that could be inappropriate out of not knowing. And she's so flexible.
That's what this is about.
So flexible. So we're gonna let her present. If you have questions, comments, I think she's open to that.
Yeah, definitely. So I think I want to kind of hold this even more so like a conversation. I've done this training. I used to do this more as like a training where I would do it for the courts here and the CASA workers here, and just training how to work with the LGBTQIA2+. And today, I want to at least hold this more like a conversation. So do not be afraid to ask questions. Do not be afraid to use terminology that you feel may be offensive or outdated. I always tell not just my students, but anybody who I'm working with, that this is an opportunity to learn. And so I will never be offended, especially in an area where we're safe looking at ways to learn and understand, because language is always evolving, especially in regards to working with this community. So I am a full-time professor at Defiance College. I'm the director of the social work department right now, and I do have a private practice here in town. I work under AJA Behavioral, where I do specialize in working with individuals in the LGBTQ+ population. So I actually really appreciate Jim and this church in particular, because often I send clients to come to this church when they're not feeling comfortable in other congregations. Knowing that this church is open and affirming is such a blessing to have in this community, because there are not a lot of resources as we find. So I thank you, because that's so comforting to have, and being so close to the college, it's also helpful to be able to encourage students who are looking to continue their faith journey but need an open and affirming congregation. So I will start right away with the terms that I find often confusing. So sex, when we're talking biological sex, so the anatomical parts that people are born with. Because a lot of times if you go fill out a job application today, or you're filling out something government related, you have to put sex or sometimes gender. And for some people, that's not the same thing. And so I always talk first about sex being different than gender, because sex is how we are born, and then gender is how we identify. Now, that doesn't mean that you cannot be born with the same sex and identify as that same sex as being your then gender. So, and I'll talk about also that term when you identify as the same biological sex you were born with. So, there's a couple ways that we then look at gender and sex. So, sexual orientation. I always say that's who you're attracted to. Your sexual orientation is the person that you choose to be maybe your partner. That's the person you are physically attracted to or emotionally attracted to. Gender identity is how you then identify your gender. So I was born female. That was my sex at birth. I identify as female. That is my gender identity. I also present pretty feminine, and always have presented pretty feminine. That is my gender expression. The way in which we choose to show the outside world our gender and how we express gender is gender expression. And then gender assignment is then how not only we identify, but how we assign our gender. And I will talk a little bit about where that can be different. So, getting right into it. L. You're gonna tell I'm a professor. L. What does L mean, or what do you believe L to be?
Lesbian.
Lesbian. So that would be somebody that's female who is sexually attracted to someone who's female. G.
Gay.
Gay. Male who is attracted to someone who's male. Don't look at me.
Bisexual.
I already shouted it out. So bisexual. Now, there's something that I want to be clear about when it comes to working with people or knowing people or helping people who are bisexual. Oftentimes, people who identify as bi have it a little more difficult in the population than people who identify as lesbian or gay. This is because people who are maybe lesbian or gay, who were born lesbian or gay, feel frustrated that somebody can identify as bisexual, where maybe one day they're in a same-sex relationship, and then it's time to go home for Thanksgiving, and they're bringing someone where it appears to be in a heterosexual relationship home to their family, where they then are not going to maybe feel the discrimination or stigma about being in a same-sex relationship. And so I often hear not only students, clients, just within the community where there is kind of not a discrimination, but a frustration, and sometimes not as kind of words put towards people who are bisexual, because they have the ability to be attracted to both the male and female gender. And so that is something I always caution people with when it comes to working with or talking to people who are bisexual, because sometimes there is difficulty within the population for somebody who's bisexual. All right, now getting into a little more difficult. So T has two. There's two levels of the T. I'm sure you all know one of them.
Transgender.
So transgender is when somebody who was born with, let's say someone's born female, and they say, you know what, I'm not female, I'm male. And so they dress and identify as male. That is transgender. However, there's also transsexual. What do you think maybe would differentiate someone from transgender to transsexual?
They actually perform and change their sex.
Absolutely. They have had the surgical procedure to change the genitalia. So when somebody has actually underwent surgical procedure to now have the genitalia that matches their identified gender, however they were not born with that genitalia, they are then identified as, or may identify as, transsexual. Q.
Questioning.
Nope.
Queer.
Yes. So, I want to talk a little bit about this because you're going to find that terminology has changed over time. I know that in years past, queer was a derogatory term that was typically used for mostly males who were sexually attracted to males, but really anybody who identified as gay or lesbian was typically thrown under this closet term of queer. That was viewed very offensively and used derogatory, right? Now, the term queer has been owned by the population and almost viewed as an empowering term to mean that you do not identify as putting a label on whether it be gender, whether it be sexual orientation. So I'm going to talk about gender in particular. If you identify as gender queer, that means that you do not identify as male, female, transgender, any of that. It means that you believe gender is fluid and that there's no defining parts to gender. You may also hear somebody say that they identify as non-binary and that they may ask for their pronouns to be they, them. that would be identifying as genderqueer. So there are celebrities right now who identify as genderqueer. So one I'm thinking of, although it's very fresh, is Demi Lovato. She was, see, they were on, and I struggle with pronouns, very much so, because I'm human, and you will find that you may struggle with pronouns, and that's okay, as long as we continue to try to work through that. So Demi Lovato, who used to identify as female, was on a Disney television show, is a musician, just recently, within the last year and a half, came out and identifying as genderqueer or non-binary. So now, when people refer to Demi Lovato, they would say they create music, not she creates music. And that's what makes the difference of being genderqueer and non-binary now.
But isn't they a plural?
It is a plural, and that's why it's so confusing.
Yeah.
Especially those of us who are used to singular terminology. I mean, when I've worked with queer clients, I have to sometimes say, you have to bear with me, that, you know, this is new. Or I've worked with clients who've transitioned. I actually just had a client who transitioned male to female. And I was used to and have to bill the female name. So when I'm putting information on the client, I'm physically putting in the female name, treating the male client, and that can be such a cross for me at times, not to mess up the name. You may hear the term dead name. Dead name means the birth name that the individual does not now identify with. So for example, Bruce Jenner. Bruce Jenner now identifies as Caitlyn Jenner, female. Bruce Jenner would be the dead name. Caitlyn Jenner would be the name that now is used.
But some of these are still legal names.
Yes, all the time.
And so
Yes.
that's a whole nother process.
Such a process. And the other thing is, a lot of these names are still legal names because they are not out to everyone. So for example, my students, I sometimes will have students who identify as a different name than shows up on my roster. That's why every class at the beginning I say, hi, Professor Salisbury, tell me how you would like me to address you. I don't even mess with the names that are on the roster, but I do ask for last name. Because then I find last name, and then I find the name, and if it's different, because even some people go by their nicknames. Or I have a student right now who goes by his middle name because his dad has his first name. So addressing someone by their name and how they want to be addressed is so important. But legally, most of the time, that has not changed. Because we all know, and I've learned, you know, with getting married too, changing your name is not an easy process. Let alone your first name, last name, any name is hard. So I always make sure to try to use the appropriate names, appropriate pronouns, but I also ask for grace when it comes to my remembering and because I'm seeing a lot of people. And so I tell my clients, bear with me. I know I might not get it right away, but in time I should be able to get it. But then when I go back to that billing form, I see that biological name, and that's where it can be tricky.
So, excuse me.
Yeah.
Your students.
Yeah.
when you're first together, do you ask them right then what pronouns they want to be identified with?
I will ask them if there is any confusion for me. I will ask them. I don't bring it out into the public because, and typically, honestly, if a student really wants to be identified with specific pronouns, they know they can come talk to me. I'm really open about being an ally to the community immediately so that students feel comfortable, and I put that out there. That if there are other pronouns that you'd like to share with me or anything you'd like to address with me, do not ever feel to come talk to me about it. The reason I don't bring that out in front of the class is because if somebody appears different than how they want their gender or their pronouns to be used, I don't want to create a target for them in the classroom.
Right.
So I'm really cautious about that. Where name, students feel a little more welcomed to share. Yeah. Other questions? please feel free. Okay, so that's queer.
Oh, I have no idea.
This is I know. We're getting into a little more of the difficult.
Let's think a second. What
I. So I is intersex. Now, it used to be that somebody who's intersex was deemed or called hermaphrodite, if you've heard that term before. So that now is considered to be an incredibly derogatory term. You would never want to say, like, my client is a hermaphrodite or my client is hermaphrodite. That is considered to be incredibly derogatory. The correct term is intersex. And what intersex would mean is that you're an individual who either has ambiguous genitalia, meaning you cannot decipher if it's the male or female genitalia, or you have been born with both genitalia.
Wow.
So that individual would then identify as intersex. I have a lot of people ask me, like, does that happen very often? Yeah. I wouldn't say that it happens often, but there are a lot of people who identify as intersex. I've treated and have been around individuals. We had someone in our office. I wasn't working with them as closely, but somewhat closely. And that was very difficult for that individual to choose how to identify based off of being intersex. You see some of the twin studies, and you see some of the early cases where a child is born with both genitalia, and the parents choose at birth to then change and reassign the genitalia to either be male or female, and then where that individual then grows later to say, wait, I'm in the wrong body, something's going on, and we've seen suicide even happen because of that. Yes?
It's also bringing up a lot of disagreement because they're saying if the child is a baby just born, how can that child make that decision?
Absolutely.
And which most parents are choosing the wrong sex and just overlooking doctor terminology and everything, so it's becoming a huge issue.
Yes, super huge issue. And in fact, you find that a lot of the parents are choosing maybe the sex or the gender of the child that they wanted to have, which then puts that child in really such a risk then, instead of allowing for the child to grow and to identify and explain to the parents their gender rather than just choosing at birth. And then we have a child that we're forcing into a gender that really, in that case, they may not have been born into. So that's a difficult one. The intersex is a difficult one. Okay, A.
Asexual?
Yes, asexual. I always tell my students, because my students are like the plant. I'm like, no, they cannot reproduce on their own. Asexual means somebody that wants no sexual relationship at all. With themselves, with anyone, no sexual relationship. Someone who is asexual has absolutely no libido and is very difficult to be paired and partnered in a relationship with somebody who does have a libido, because they are not looking for any type of sexual experience, physical experience, anything. And so somebody who is asexual, some people ask me, well, are you born asexual? Sometimes. For women, sometimes it's trauma related. Maybe there was sexual abuse, maybe there was sexual assault. And so this is somebody that absolutely wants nothing to do with any type of sexual relationship, but typically wants companionship. And so luckily, they make online dating and online resources for other individuals who are asexual. And so if you can find another partner who's asexual, typically that type of relationship, that type of marriage can look healthier than if you were to have somebody who was asexual and then a partner that was not. So that's one, especially, I do a lot of couples work. And that's something that I'm always really cautious about in the beginning, is making sure that if I do have somebody who is asexual, really discovering and working through, like, is this compatibility long-term? Because that's a difficult relationship. Not that it can't work, it just makes things very difficult. 2.
That's a new one.
That's the one that I think I usually stump everyone on. 2. So it's the number.
It's two-spirit.
Yeah, yes. Very good.
What?
So excited.
Two-spirit.
Two-spirited. So two-spirited is when somebody, it's derived from Native American culture, and it's very cultural. And the belief that somebody's spirit has both masculine and feminine energy. Now, you don't hear a lot about two-spirited in the United States, which is unfortunate, especially since Native Americans were here first and should be able to identify that way. You do hear a lot of identification of that in Canada. So I was like really impressed when the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, brought out and said, you know, we invite everyone. We invite, and then he goes through the entire list and says two-spirited, and I was like, yeah, okay. You know, you don't hear that from the United States. You don't hear that from a lot of areas, and for many of you, this may be the first time you've even heard that term. So
Yeah, it is.
that is how you identify two-spirited. Then there's the plus. Some people will say, like, what does the plus mean? And I always say, well, that means everything else. So that could include pansexual. Have you heard pansexual before, maybe? A lot of teenagers identify as pan. They'll say, I'm pan. And I think that that's a confusing one for a lot of people, because pansexual is when you are attracted. Now, this can go two ways. You can look at it religiously, or you can look at it spiritually. If you're looking religiously, you will sometimes hear people say, I'm attracted to the soul of the person. I don't care about genitalia. I don't care about gender. I don't care about physical appearance or any of that. I am attracted to their soul. That is pansexual from a more of a religious viewpoint. A spiritual standpoint, where you may have somebody who doesn't want to use the term soul because maybe that is too uncomfortable for them, you will maybe hear them say personality or their character. I'm really attracted to their personality. Now, we can still be attracted to people. I always say, I'm a heterosexual woman. I'm attracted to personalities, right? I always say, I hope I'm attracted to my husband's personality. But for somebody who's pansexual, they would say, yeah, but it's only the personality, the soul. It's not the physical attraction. It's not anything beyond that. And what that means is somebody who identifies as pansexual doesn't care if you're male, female, transgender, transsexual, genderqueer. They don't care anything about any of that. It's genuinely just the attraction to the soul or the personality or character. Okay. Questions?
You can sure have a lot of the pluses, can't you?
There's a lot of pluses. I don't go as much into the pluses. Like non-binary is one that could also be challenged, but I talk about that when I talk about genderqueer. Yes?
I thought I heard somewhere somebody talk about demisexual.
Yeah. I think there are so many terms now. I just heard one the other day that I was not even as familiar with. I think it just, the way that we identify, we continue to add to the plus section is what I will say. I can't say that I am an expert in all of the plus section, but there are a lot. So for example, there's one I haven't told you that you should probably know that I think is on the next, let me see if it's on the next slide. So it's not there yet, but it will be coming. Because I am a female, I was born female, and I identify as a female. I'm cisgender.
You're what?
CIS gender.
Okay.
So you may have somebody say to you, so you're a part of the community, you're an ally, are you cis? And that's like, what? And what they're talking about is, do you identify with the same anatomical parts you were born with? So I was born female, I identify as female, I'm cisgender. So that would be another one that would be, that is not technically a part of the community, that is a way that you identify yourself if you are not transgender, transsexual, genderqueer, non-binary.
And it's for both men and women?
Yeah.
That sounds like it's a female.
Right.
Cis.
And it's
Are you a cis?
yeah, and it's CIS
Yes.
gender.
Interesting.
But they're always evolving and continual. Somebody told me something else the other day, and I was like, I don't know that. and that's, I'm human. I even though this is an area that I like to say that I'm researching a lot, that I'm continuing to practice, there's still new developing terminology all of the time that I'm not even as familiar with. Something that I sometimes struggle with is individuals who identify, and I do struggle with this, where someone may identify, so someone might be female, but identify with the pronouns she, they. And or she, them. She, them. Instead of they, them. I have a client like that, and I always mess that up. And they know that, because I'm like, you gotta help me here. So it's a constant educating yourself, asking questions. I always tell people, just ask how somebody wants to be identified. Just ask. If you come from a yearning to know position instead of a defensive or aggressive position, most individuals are open to share and want to educate. That's been my understanding and my experience. So I think as long as we come out of respect to somebody who is in the community who wants to share, and we are coming with questions out of wanting to be educated, that you often will get a response from that person that's not only educating you, but is also thankful. Thank you for wanting to address me the way that I would prefer to be addressed, because so many people don't. Yes?
I have, I guess, a medical question.
Yeah, go ahead.
When somebody is,
Yeah, intersex.
At birth,
Yep.
is there a medical reason to immediately assign a sex, or is there?
That's
can
parent
you wait into?
Yeah, you can wait. You can wait. That's parent choice. The problem that comes with that, especially with ambiguous genitalia, is sometimes they have a hard time deciphering if it's a micropenis or you have an enlarged clitoris. And the problem with that is if you start messing around with gender and not allowing the body to develop, that can create even more issues. Because if that was a clitoris, that creates more problems for the female.
Later on.
Yeah. Assuming that was a micropenis.
So-
it really can create issues.
So somewhere when the child is verbal and beginning to interact with other people, then he or she, they can decide
Yes.
with mom and dad.
Yes.
And have whatever corrective surgery might be necessary.
Yes.
And there's no,
Right.
and are doctors starting to advise that, or is that still in its infancy?
It's still very much in its infancy, and I think part of the problem is, so the parent or the guardian, we know this I think about all the other, so if I have a child who I think maybe is going to identify as transgender and is going to need hormone therapy treatment, they are going to need, that's a whole process, and I'll talk about that. They need an endocrinologist. If the parent says no, then it stops with the parent. Let's say the parent wants the child to transition. That also goes with the parent. These are some of the ethical and legal questions we have, the same with all kinds of body rights when it comes to minors. And so, yeah, that's a continual issue. Something that I find to be interesting is a child cannot transition unless they've been diagnosed by a therapist, sometimes a medical doctor. I prefer somebody in the mental health field with gender dysphoria. So once you've been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, you have to live 2 years, is what you're supposed to do, under the identity of living transgender before you can even begin really doing the hormone treatment to then look at possibly the end goal being the surgical reassignment. However, you have to catch that so early before you hit puberty. Well, therapists have a lot of liability on them when doing this diagnosis for a couple of reasons. One, as soon as you start with an endocrinologist, you become sterile. So whether you're male or female, let's say you're 12 years old, that's a decision at 12 years old that you're making to never be able to have biological children because you're starting that hormone treatment. As a therapist, that's a lot to take on by putting that diagnosis down. I had a situation a few years ago where a mother brought their child in wanting to transition female to male. I felt really uncomfortable. I'm like, something's off, something's off, something's off. Thank goodness we did more treatment, and I halted that because what really had happened is the child had been sexually abused by the father who said, "You're my little girl." So then the child wanted to transition to be male, thinking that that would prevent further abuse. So in situations like this, we as professionals have to be so cautious in going forward with that process because that child is really needing trauma treatment, not an endocrinologist. So I go both ways on some of this, because sometimes I'm like, yes, 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 but then sometimes I'm like, wait a second, this feels trauma. I don't think we should move forward with transition.
And this happened a long time ago. This has been around
Yes,
for years. It just wasn't
yes,
that. But another issue that's coming up also is with your Asians, other cultures. They're dealing with the LGBTQIA2
yes.
club. And that's really, really big now also.
Right. And a lot of cultures, are not going to be accepting. And so then you not only have rejection from maybe your faith, now you have rejection from your culture and your family.
Right.
And so then who are your supports? And that's why we see such a large suicide risk with all members of this community. Yeah.
My son ran into a problem last summer that he works for Center College, and one of his employees went to college there and was a big football player, who is now a female.
Mm-hmm.
But once all that wiped out some way, all those years that he played football and so forth, and resented that they couldn't take it off of his record.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, it was really and she thought that no one cared about her and that whole bit because they wouldn't take it off of the record.
Right.
He played football, but now is a female. The same way with my daughter Kate, female.
Mm-hmm.
Jenny became Jake.
Mm-hmm.
But when Jake visits, we talk about the time that Jenny was Jenny, and now, he doesn't have any problem with it.
Right.
Accepting the fact. But this young person did not want anything on the records. How do you wipe out a 21, 22-year life?
And you
then-
can't.
Yeah.
And you can't. And just like, that's why I talk about Bruce Jenner,
Right.
who is an Olympic athlete, married Kris
It's
Kardashian.
there. There's no hiding it.
Yeah. And so I think if I had someone who was doing that or struggling with that, that's where treatment's needed. That's where therapy is needed to process and be able to move forward with acceptance of, okay, this was part of your journey. This may not, my guess is an individual like that really struggled during that time and wants to forget that time and doesn't want that time following them for lots of reasons, obviously stigma. But there's treatment that would help with that. There's therapy that would help with that, to be able to process and kind of move forward. And that would be my recommendation for somebody who had that going on. Other questions? Yeah.
Well, I was just wondering, I have a friend, knew him from high school, good friends. We stayed in contact. He got married, he had 3 kids. His wife died 3 years ago. And all of a sudden on Facebook, he starts talking about Fred, so I'm thinking Frederica, you know. And is that something he probably struggled with his whole life? That,
It's hard to say.
yeah.
It's really hard to
Without
say.
asking, I'm not going to
Yeah. No. It's hard to say.
It's like
You know, I've seen people that have struggled their entire life. I've seen people get married and live heterosexual marriages and be hiding the whole time from this. I've seen that with sexuality, not just gender. I've seen that. I've seen it all the way across the board, and I think each and every person has their own individual story and how they've struggled. And so I think it probably would just depend. Unless you do ask the person or talk to the person or be that person's therapist, you'll never know.
No.
And I think the thing that I've learned is, as long as we just treat everyone with respect and dignity, I mean, that's the best we can do, because you never know if you're the only person who's ever treated that person that way. Yes.
This is, in my own, I tried to memorize all these, I can't remember to save my life, so.
It's okay.
But it's fine. I really appreciated people talking about being fluid.
Mm-hmm.
And I've just adopted, really, I'm gonna treat you that way.
Yeah.
I'm gonna start with fluidity,
Yeah.
and then we'll work on it, because it was a conversation, in fact, it's through Jim that really opened this up, where he'd been talking to somebody, and the person's kind of gender fluid.
Yeah.
And
Sometimes
one day
they present as male, sometimes they
They
present as
present
female.
as female, present as male, and,
Yep.
and I'm sitting like, why not? You know, I
Uh-huh.
mean, that was like that moment, and I thought, why am I so worried? They're like, wait a minute, on Tuesday, you were like this, and on
Right,
don't worry about it, Fred.
yes,
Right.
yes.
And that's something that's really, to me, is said,
That's right.
letting the person tell us and how you're doing today, and we
Fancy
start
tripod.
looking at just who they are and who we are. So I mean, the fluidity part just freed me from worrying. I mean, it's good to know, but
Yeah.
I don't have to know them
No.
that way.
No. Exactly. And the other thing is, you know, we were told how to be in society based off of gender. I mean, today, even if I laugh because I was raised by a therapist, and my mother, the therapist, tried to raise my brother and I gender fluid and gender neutral, allowing us to identify our own gender. And I turned out Barbie doll, and my brother turned out basketball player, and my mom says, it doesn't matter. What's going to happen is your child's going to either be socialized or take the course in which they take. And so it didn't matter that I wasn't allowed to be dressed up like the cheerleader. I still was one, and a dancer. You know, it didn't matter how she tried to create the fluid. It just still happened that way. And so there's a lot of people who are angry with, okay, if I go to Walmart or if I go to Meijer and I look down the toy aisle, there's still that sea of pink.
Right, right.
And there's still those Hot Wheels all separated. And so if you think about, and I always ask my students, when was the first time you really knew your gender? And they're like, well, my mom dressed me in pink, you know? And I'm like, okay, but when did you know? Well, when I went to school, I used the girls' bathroom. Okay, but like, when did you know? And I think that that's a question that we don't really process. Is like, we were told we were female. I wasn't. I was gender fluid, and I was dressing my brother up like Barbie. And my mom was like, "You don't get to pick his gender; he gets to pick it." So, you know, I think it's interesting to think about how this all evolves and when these types of decisions are then made.
It's real, I mean, I'm 69, now everybody knows my age. But I grew up in Texas,
Mm-hmm.
and we had two friends that they were our dear friend. Well, we knew they were different, and we didn't allow anybody to call them punk or queer or whatever. But we just knew it was just the way they were.
Yes.
They just act that way, you know. They were born that way.
Yeah.
It wasn't, but we respected them and everything. It was, I mean, we look back and say, well, why were those two men living together? Which back in those days, you
Yeah.
didn't dare talk about what
Right.
adults were doing, but
Right.
just
Right.
the way it was, you know. And me being in education, this is what we're dealing with today.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, so I went to college in 2006,
Right.
and I went to a small liberal arts private college. And the college that I went to at that time, because think about it, 2006 was not that long ago.
Right.
We were not allowed to, so females were not allowed to be in male dorms on Mondays. And they called Monday Gay Day because you could only be in the rooms with your same sex. Basically being derogatory to the term.
Okay.
The faculty, the staff, the students all knew Monday was Gay Day. This was like printed in emails. And so now, being a faculty member of a very open and affirming institution, a member of the alumni came to meet with me a few years ago and asked me my opinions on the institution in which I had attended. And I said, you know, something that really bothered me was that gay day. That gay day really bothered me because there were people in my dorms that were lesbian and did not feel comfortable coming out, seeing that their faculty, their staff, their pastor of chapel, and everything on campus was like saying, woo, you're not accepted, don't come out here. And then what happened is you would then graduate from college and then everybody would come out because then they went somewhere safe. And so that really resonated with me on how, not even that long ago, how
Right.
discriminatory, that was an institution. Like looking back, I'm thinking like legally, how was that okay that this was happening?
I know. We have there's a girls' school in Toledo.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the principal became principal, everything in the school was pink.
Mm-hmm.
Drove me nuts. And I always ask Neil, is everything pink? You know, and
Right.
just the idea that the pink bothered me,
Yeah.
like, you know.
Right.
And I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you mentioned that because it still bothers me.
Yeah.
Pink.
Yeah.
But there's another aspect to all of this. My nephew, who died 30 years ago, he was 28, he was gay,
Mm-hmm.
okay? Long before Magic Johnson came along and, you know,
Yes.
with all his relationships and survived.
Yes.
But my nephew did not survive,
Sure.
and all his group, who was a makeup artist in Hollywood,
Mm-hmm.
all his group died from AIDS,
Sure.
which we all were petrified, thinking that even if you got near a gay person. So you got sexual transmission of things that go along with all of these things too,
Mm-hmm.
that play a big part
Absolutely.
in this, and or passing it on to your partner that is not gay. So, you know, there's another aspect to this as far as the sexual
You know,
orientation.
I think it's interesting too, especially as and I like can't even talk about medical things because I still have PTSD from COVID. But I hear a lot of people making those kind of assumptions then because I mean that HIV and that experience with AIDS was very real and very real for a lot of people. And I feel frustrated sometimes where monkeypox, for example,
Right.
is being talked about. And there are greater risk of certain sexual transmissions with that. But then to label, we hear the labeling then of monkeypox. Oh, that's only for, I heard somebody say the other day, oh, that's only for queers. And I'm like, You know, first of all, that term's like not even offensive anymore. So if you're trying to offend someone, don't even use that term. Secondly, you know, it's that stigma that comes with. And so yes, there are some very serious, real elements too that come with that. And there's not a lot of education. And you know, that goes back to, we have no sexual education in the schools other than abstinence, and that's still being pushed. And then, and protective measures for people in the community that need to know about protection and understanding protection and contraception, and we don't have that. I will be the first to tell you, because I teach a lot of sexuality in my classes, I am flabbergasted when my students come to college and don't know. Someone actually told me in confidence, I don't know what contraception is. And I said, do you mean the term? And they're like, no, like I've never even seen that, and I've been sexually active for years.
Wow.
That, or how do I get that? How do I get protection? And so it's just wild to me, the lack of education. That's why a lot of times people don't feel comfortable talking about their own struggles with sexuality because they never even had the conversations about sexuality. I'm gonna see what else I have here. So sexual orientation is the way that you then identify. Now, I did want to add some terms that we don't oftentimes think about being offensive would be like lifestyle, preference. So, what's your sexual preference? Sounds like, okay, when you go to Taco Bell, do you get a quesadilla or a chalupa? Because you get to choose because you weren't born that way. Do you hear that? So when we say like, who do you prefer, makes it sound like, okay, you were definitely not born this way, you're just choosing this. So that's why I typically steer away from sexual preference. The other thing is lifestyle. Some people will be like, I don't agree with that lifestyle. I'm like, okay. That's one, very offensive. Two, I always tell my students, like, are you their partner? Like, are you going home with them? Because if not, then it's not, like, why are you judging and saying the term lifestyle? So we have to be cautious of that because that term can be really offensive. Question? Okay, I talked about cisgender, I talked about intersex, I talked about all of that. I'm just making sure I'm not forgetting anything. Okay, we talked a little bit about gender expression and the way that we dress and who tells us how to dress. And like Fred was talking about gender fluidity and how that can change from day to day. That's why sometimes, I know like Gap is a clothing example that has an entire section that you can go to that would be, there's like male, female, and then gender neutral. And you can find gender neutrality clothing. I could tell you can find that at Baby Gap too, because I have a little girl, and at times, I prefer some of the boys' clothing because they have cooler t-shirts. So if I want to get an AC/DC t-shirt, I gotta go to the boys section. But you find too that there's clothing stores that are more open to the gender neutral clothing now than previously. And you see that, like you can see unisex is what it will say. It'll say male, female, unisex, and then you can, or boys, girls, unisex, and then you can pick from that in terms of how people express gender. Bathrooms I wanted to talk about. So the other issue that comes for a lot of individuals who are transgender and transsexual is what bathroom, which locker room, what is appropriate. So at Defiance College, something I am very thankful that we have in Schaffler Hall is we have gender neutral bathrooms, and we identify them as gender neutral bathrooms on the second floor of Schaffler Hall. So if you do not feel comfortable going into the male or female bathroom in Schaffler Hall, which is where I teach, there are 2 gender neutral bathrooms upstairs, and they are identified as gender neutral bathrooms. And so even like our counseling center will say we have 2 gender neutral bathrooms in this hall. I don't know about, does Defiance Hall have gender neutral bathrooms?
Upstairs.
Yeah. And so that is something that in time we have tried to provide for our students because that I know can be an issue. Now some stores have spoke out and wanted to create gender neutral bathrooms and like kind of the openness to the bathrooms, like Target, for example. Target's like, hey, we don't care what bathroom you go in, everyone's accepted here, and we're gonna provide gender neutral bathrooms. Then that became a big stink. Everybody got mad at Target, boycotting Target, because they're creating these bathrooms. And then if you go, I show this segment that I love. It's a pastor who says, if you go to the Target bathroom, your child will be stolen and molested by somebody who's transgender. And I'm like,
Jeez.
first of all, you're a pastor, this is a problem. Second of all, really a lot of misinformation. And so I share that with my class because I'm like, hey, this is what we don't say or how we don't act, because that's totally inappropriate and creates fear. And you see a lot of this, especially on social media, creating fear. When truth be told, the most at risk of all people to be sexually abused or sexually harmed in a bathroom, I should say sexually assaulted, is Black transgender women. That is the highest number of assaults. And so that demographic particularly is very, very at risk for assault, abuse, I mean, awful. We've even seen where, within the same program, an individual went into a hotel for a funeral, and they wouldn't let the individual stay at the hotel because they were a Black transgender woman, and then arrested her because she was arguing that. So if we look at the discrimination and like the bathroom problem, it's not what we think it is. And so I think that there needs to be more education based off of that.
And it's not even if you're transgender.
Oh,
I know
yeah.
a couple who were lesbian.
Yeah.
And one partner had very short hair and was wearing jeans and a sweatshirt on a vacation trip. And they stopped to use the bathroom. And people were blocking her from the
Yeah.
women's room. She's a federal judge.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it just, she, was just like, just going, she chooses not to wear makeup.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and they weren't gonna let her in the women's room. And
Yeah, I don't
she
know
had
what
to
the
get-
bathroom
she-
deal
I mean,
is.
I think she almost said, "You want me to take my pants down?"
Yeah, right.
But,
Yeah.
Yeah,
she
no
had to-
kidding. It's like,
it floored her, and it was really
Yeah, that's awful.
an awful experience
So
to
awful.
go through.
Yes, yes.
I mean, we've gotten so judgmental about who's who.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
when
in
I-
the bathroom, like, go to the bathroom. I don't ever understand, like, why can't you just go to the bathroom and wash your hands, please, and then
Yeah.
continue your day?
Yeah.
And going into a women's room where they close
There's
the
doors.
Yes.
Yeah, there's
just
doors.
leave
Yeah.
her alone.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's a constant issue.
that's terrible.
Yes.
It's ridiculous.
See, when I was younger, little, when a female was, they were always called butch.
Yes.
That's
Yep.
one of those bad terms, but.
But I don't think anyone
You're
kept her from going in the bathroom, though, at that time. I don't know.
No.
We never
No.
heard about it anyway.
Sure.
I don't know.
Sure. Sure.
It's weird.
The bathroom thing is a problem.
So would that roles there apply now in sports, which is driving everyone right up
Like the
wall?
swimming situation where the trans female swimmer won that award, and yeah, there's
I mean,
a lot,
it bothers my daughter,
yeah,
who's a runner,
uh-huh,
and she said, well, that a male that's a female can run faster
Yes.
than, she said, I don't care what anyone says, I mean, you can't convince her any other way. Not that it's a problem that they've changed, it's just that she doesn't want to have to compete against the person who was a male as far
Right.
as she's concerned.
of course.
Yeah.
No, and that's, I think these are just continual questions, and like, I don't even have the answer. I always say, I don't even know. How do you monitor that? How do you, because we want to be open and affirming, we want to be accepting, and we want to be understanding, but there is some realities to biological as well. And so I think that is where you're seeing a lot of kind of the uproar in the sports area. Especially, I know the swimming, that was a big point of controversy.
I think it's in the running now, too.
Well, there were the proposed bills for Ohio for trans athletes too. That was, regardless of your beliefs, it was an absolutely outrageous
Yeah,
fix.
yeah,
Well, and the ridiculous thing is, though, I mean, as a runner, the top runners in the world are physiologically different than I am.
yes,
They already are and I'll never compete with them.
right.
So,
You mean, Jim, you got it.
and there's female runners that are physiologically different than me that I would never be able to compete with. So
I know, like
it's just
with the
silly.
swimming situation, like in college, they do like, which I don't know, probably not enough tests for it, but they do like monitor and test like your estrogen versus
Yeah.
testosterone levels, and yes.
But that's, I don't know. That's why I was like really upset with the stuff that Ohio proposed for like high school and middle school sports. Because some people, I mean, was it PCOS? Like that's just a common thing with women that alters your
Yep. And you'd have to
hormones
take-
that,
Mhm.
someone could be producing a bit too much testosterone or something like that would, even if they're born a woman, born a
Well,
female.
in some of the bills that, like, so Kentucky, for example, tried to put through a bill that in elementary schools and high schools, you had to show your birth certificate every time you went to the bathroom. Shot children.
Say that again.
In Kentucky, I should send you the link of the pastor and all of
Yes.
this. In Kentucky, they were trying to propose a bill that you would have to, a child in elementary or in high school would have to show their birth certificate every time they went to the bathroom at school. And if you caught somebody going into, there was a fine of like $1,500 if you went into the wrong bathroom. So my husband and I were talking about it. I was like, if I was a kid, I would have you go in the wrong bathroom, because then they started paying people for catching the people that were going in the wrong bathroom. Because I'm sure there wasn't enough staff to administer this. So then I would be like, you go in the wrong bathroom, they're going to pay me for catching you, we split the money. It's so bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre. So I think we continue to see a lot of absurdity trying to go through legislation to, continue to stigmatize trans people in general.
And I think we continue to try to apply binaries where there is a spectrum.
Oh, yeah,
That's the biggest issue.
definitely.
Because even though I identify as male, I'm sure if I was tested in a certain way, I might be different than Fred
Sure.
in some way. So
Absolutely.
we're all on a spectrum. We're not,
Right.
binaries don't exist.
Right, exactly. And then I always try to tell people, the biggest issue that I find, especially when working with kids, is still the heterosexism that is brought out. So a couple years ago, and they won't care that I share this, I've asked them if I could continue to share this in class. We don't think about necessarily the heterosexual privilege that those of us who are heterosexual have until some of the comments have been made and we open our mouths and say things that make absolute no sense. So for example, something that offended a same-sex couple that was in one of my classes was, so I had two women in a same-sex relationship, and they're oftentimes asked, okay, which one of you is the male, which one of you is the female?
Yes.
Which says, again, there has to be a male and a
Binary,
female.
right.
And my students are always like, yeah, but there's always somebody that's maybe a little more masculine than feminine. I'm like, no.
One of them's gotta be butch.
And they go to that idea of there still has to be masculine and feminine.
It's a
But
binary.
they often refer to one as a husband.
Well,
They still
Some.
do that.
some will do that. Some individuals still do that. But it's the fact that somebody heterosexual says,
Right.
which one of you is male and which one of you is female, that makes it so heterosexist. And I think that that's something, or you're too pretty, why are you a lesbian? Or, oh man, that man is really, really attractive. That's just too bad. What a waste. He's gay. I hear that on, I'm like, what?
Yes.
Where did we get this? So all of those are examples of heterosexism, heterosexist talk and language that I think we don't a lot of times think about.
Just think about what they're not saying, what's going on.
Yeah. And you know what? I teach my class. We do this whole section on, it's called Ist and Isms. And we talk about how are we racist, how do we experience racism, how are we sexist, how do we experience sexism. And one of them is heterosexist and heterosexism. It is normal, if you are heterosexual, to have internalized homophobic thoughts. That is normal. That is how you are socialized. Maybe you're watching a film and you see a male and a male kiss and you're like, oh, that's not for me. Well, yeah, you're not. It's not. You're heterosexual. Just as my very dear friend who is gay and sees, I remember, he tried to kiss a girl when we were in college and he's like, that was disgusting. And I say and laugh and say, yeah, that is your own internalized feelings about your own sexuality. You're allowed to have the thoughts. It's stopping the thoughts, understanding the thoughts, processing the thoughts, and not going out into the world and discriminating. That is where it becomes, it is normal, it is biologically normal to have the thought of like, oh, I wouldn't do that. We know. We know you wouldn't do that. But that doesn't mean that somebody else wouldn't look at what you're doing and think, oh, I wouldn't do that. And so I think it's important for us to pay attention to those thoughts are normal. It's what we do with those thoughts.
Is it odd, though, when you sometimes look at somebody and you say, oh, they've got to be gay?
I think that society has socialized you. You look at somebody, maybe they have more feminine behaviors, a male with more feminine characteristics, because we have been socialized to believe that men who have more feminine characteristics in dress are gay. In my time in high school, which is no longer a thing, they oftentimes would find a male that dressed really well, which was always what I was very attracted to. They would be like, oh, that person's metrosexual. They dress more like, you know, a little more feminine. And you're only attracted to metros. So that was a term that was oftentimes used when early 2000s, when I was in school, because I was like, yeah, I like when men dress well. And I still do. And so I think that's a part of us understanding, you know, Kinsey put sexuality on a continuum. That there's no such thing as somebody who's totally straight and somebody who's totally gay. We all fall on Alfred Kinsey, who's like one of the best and biggest specialists in sex and sexuality, says we all fall somewhere in the middle. There's nobody, like you can't be like totally gay, totally straight. Most sexuality falls somewhere in the middle, and that's that fluidity. That it's not, we can't think in terms of black, white, rigid thinking. There's gray. And with sex and with the community, there's always the gray. If that's a good way of putting it. You know, the last thing I want to say is like, especially because I send a lot of people in the community to church and to congregations that are open and affirming, we have to also recognize that a lot of people who feel safe maybe talking to you about this do not feel safe talking to other people and do not have the ability to come out, because when they come out, they're facing family rejection, they're facing peer rejection, institutional rejection. There are doctors in this area that treat patients differently based off of their gender and their sexual orientation. And I know that because they come see me. And I mean, that is what floors me. That to not feel comfortable going to your primary care physician for your sinus infection because of who and how you identify is beyond me. And so that is a constant problem that we see. Homelessness, especially teens. Teens who come out that are not accepted, there is a lot of homelessness. There's a lot of substance use that comes with covering a lot of this. An increased risk of suicide. We just found out there was something that was put out in NASW this week that adolescents around 13 is really the primary age where there's an increased risk in suicide right now because of not feeling comfortable coming out. And honestly, in some ways, this generation that we have right now happening is really open about a lot of things. Even therapy. Like, it's cool to go to therapy, which is very interesting to me as a therapist, because that was, when I was in school, that was always a private mental health personal thing, where now it's like, oh, you have a therapist? I have a therapist. And they all share who their therapist is, and then they all come tell me, and I'm just like, woo woo. So that is still an issue, is the suicide risk. For anybody in this population. Depression, definitely, low self-esteem, and like I said, institutional rejection, whether that be a medical facility, whether that be your school, whether that be your principal, whether that be your church. I mean, all across the board, there's rejection. So keeping in mind that these individuals who are coming to us in whatever capacity are afraid to be outed and are afraid of providers. They're afraid of going places that have bathrooms. They hide and don't go places because they're afraid to go and be outed and be blocked in the bathroom. And they don't have a lot of role models who are out, whether that be family members, whether that be, there's still a lot of discrimination towards out celebrities, out football players, out athletes, especially athletes. There's a lot of discrimination against athletes that are out. And so just keeping that in mind. All right, definitely thinking about keeping people safe. I have a list of resources. If you ever need any other resources, I can help you with that. If you have somebody that needs treatment, I know a therapist and a few. So I know some safe therapists you could send them to. And then going forward, I always say, do not assume about anything about a person. Challenge people when they say the inappropriate stereotypes. Educate yourself, continue. I all the time have to continue educating myself because there's continual change, especially with language. Examine your own biases. Like I said, pay attention to the internalized thoughts of, okay, I had this thought. How do I feel about this thought? Why did I have this thought? Mm-hmm. And that really helps you process. Because if we sit here and we're like, oh, I've never been racist. I've never been sexist, classist, ageist, ableist. We're lying. And that is how we don't move forward and don't progress. All right. Any other questions? I know
awesome.
I have questions.
Yeah.
But it's education, starting from my kindergarten 5-year-olds that I'm taught. The materials that are in their hands to read or not to read in this day and age. And life is not black and white.
Right.
And somehow to
But isn't that right now the big thing about taking all that material out of libraries and schools?
Oh, yeah.
And that schools are teaching this and this is wrong, you should not be teaching this because then you're making them want to be, isn't that the big argument right now?
Well, there is a lot, it depends where you are, but yes, there is a lot of argument in education about what do we expose children to and what do we not expose children to. And because it's no different than in the past when I was in school, that if we talk about being gay, then everybody will want to be gay. It's literally that. And
if you talk about sex, everybody will want to have sex.
Don't talk about sex or condoms because then they may find them.
That's right.
And so that is,
yes.
I think it's just a continual issue. That's a great point because that's what's going on in education. Absolutely. That's why then they come to me in college and I'm like, all right, we're talking. Because I can't keep my mouth shut on this anymore. So if you come to college, then you'll hear it. But I don't think.
That's really good.
Yeah. In K through 12, you don't hear it.
There was a student that came out and it was this has really bothered me for a long time. So he was in the office, or they were in the office, and he was sitting at a table, and I looked at his profile. Just beautiful. Mm-hmm. Cheekbones. It was what you wanted your daughter to look like.
Mhm.
And I said, God, was he really a girl?
Mhm.
His hands,
Mhm.
just beautiful.
Mhm.
It's like he just evolved in all of this.
Yeah.
You know? And I said, yeah, I mean, he was my kindergartner, right?
Right.
Or they were my kindergartner, which I never, he was just gorgeous.
Mhm.
And I often wondered, you know, from kindergarten to 6th grade, came out, thank God we had a wonderful counselor.
Yeah.
But the girls got involved and they wanted the boys to
Yeah.
like her.
Uh-huh.
It's just all mess and
Yes.
everything. But
Especially at that age, it gets messy.
yes,
Mhm.
and it was just, it never left my mind because he was just, or she was just perfect.
Mhm.
She was perfect. And I said, wow. It just, I never could forget it.
Mhm.
The features were there, everything. And she wanted to be who she wanted to be.
Mhm. And I think that's interesting too when you find somebody, and I think we were discussing this earlier, is when you have somebody that's been holding back for so long and then they finally come out, you see such a personality change.
I know, it was just.
It's confidence, it's not the anger anymore, it's not the hiding anymore. And so that's always something that you see, I don't want to say for everyone, but for a lot of people you see. And then some people are offended by that. They're like, don't be boastful about this. We don't want to see this. We don't want, I hear that all the time, especially with things like pride. Like, we don't want to see, like, why are you parading this in our face? These are the terms and the things I hear. But reality is, a lot of individuals have been hiding how they've been feeling for so long that it's liberating to feel that they're coming into their own and how they really are.
And it's sad about the ignorance of our children.
Oh, yeah.
This day and time.
Yeah.
It's just sad, which a lot of them already know. But it's the wrong that they know.
Right,
And you need to know the right.
right.
Do you have?
And I don't understand what better place to learn than in a school.
Well, and I think bullying doesn't end at 3 p.m. anymore. You know, we have constant communication with social media, and so bullying goes, and for my kids, it seems like all night long. They're always, when I say my kids, I'm talking about my clients. They're up all night on their phones talking and fighting, and that's a concern too, is that the bullying doesn't stop at 3 p.m. on the bus. It goes all night.
My mom told me that she heard that schools are taking over the rights of the parents and forcing children to have sex changes. And I said, where are you hearing
That's
this?
legally not allowed.
I know, I said, they can't take the rights away from parents. And she said, no, but they're saying they're doing that in the schools now.
No.
And I'm thinking, where, so if she's hearing it, so are some other people spreading this
And
around.
there's a certain news
Facebook, I
channel.
bet.
I think if anything, it's the
Fox
schools that
News.
are
Yeah.
So,
tolerating this.
I can't
I know.
believe that there are people believing that.
Well, I think there's a lot of scare tactics out
Oh,
there.
yeah.
Just like if you go to, that pastor said if you go to Olive Garden and take your daughter into the bathroom, she's going to be abducted by somebody transgender. And I was like, what? And now I was like, now people aren't going to go to the Olive Garden. So I think that that's what a lot of that is a lot of misrepresented information that's then spread just like on Facebook, like you find anything made up. And so I would imagine, because no, that legally would not be acceptable.
No.
They would have a lot more
Yeah.
power if the schools can do that.
Yeah.
Do they have any kind of results on children from parents that are same sex?
Yes,
Because it is very noted, especially with people that are well-known.
yes.
And are they seeing any kind of phobias or problems because it's either two women, two men, and so forth?
Yeah, so I worked in foster care, and one of the joys that I had was being able to help same-sex couples get licensed. to be able, although I will tell you, in order to be a same-sex couple and adopt, you have to jump through a million more hoops than a heterosexual couple, which has always been interesting to me, because a lot of heterosexual couples have kids that they don't want, and then you got this couple that really wants kids and are paying a lot of money and hopping through a lot of hoops to get the child. So the stigma that we used to hear there was like, oh, now the kids are going to be gay because their parents are gay, or oh, now they're going to be sexually abused, which actually is typically the highest amount of sexual abuse is done by a heterosexual male. So we would always be like, huh? What are you talking about? But yes, there is no statistics that show that a same-sex couple has any influence on sexuality or abuse in terms of when you're comparing them to a heterosexual couple.
Well, this doesn't quite go with it, but my children are adopted, and the college actually took our twins for a whole quarter and watched them because they were adopted in their psychology to see if those children were different from other children that were not adopted. I mean,
Sure.
Talk about the same,
Sure.
And I mean, they did that for they'd come to the house and we'd take them up there, and they tried to observe and see if there was anything different in their reaction, the fact that they were adopted.
I think the hardest thing that I ever observed in my career, well, there's been a lot, but one of the hardest things I ever observed in my career was prior to same-sex marriage legalization, was I had a same-sex couple who had adopted a child, but only one person could adopt them because the marriage wasn't considered legal. So the partner who had adopted the child passed away, and that partner then was not able to have their child anymore. This was the child that they raised. And then the child then had to go back into the system and was readopted.
Oh my gosh.
They do get bullied though, because I know somebody that when he's left off to school, the kids, oh, you got two mommies. Ooh.
Yep.
They bully him and tease him terrible. He's such a nice boy, and they just really
What's
bully him.
interesting is then when they come to college, so I have students who have same-sex parents. Then when they come to college, they raise their hand in my class and they're like, I have two moms. And it's almost like they embrace. I've had multiple students who are like, I'm different, I have two moms. And I've seen in college actually where the students embrace it. And so you're right, because at that age they don't understand it. And it's almost like when in college they process through a lot of their life and then they kind of own it. Or at least my students do, but because they feel safe.
Coming out.
Yeah.
They're loved.
Yeah. Yep.
They are loved.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
Put the glasses up on it.
Tess, thank you.
Oh,
Yes,
absolutely.
yes,
This is fun. I love this. Thank you for coming. And don't hesitate if you have any other questions. My email, Jim has my email, and I'm always available
Yes.
by emailing.